75 years. Ian, welcome to PanU. Thank you very much for doing this. Why did you write a book about the special relationship?
Well, in a way, in a spirit of lament, in that the world I grew up in and was born into, we had a tendency to idealize the Anglo-American world. Me, for personal reasons, because my mother was British. I grew up in a country that had been occupied by the Nazis. My mother's family were Jewish. My great-grandparents were immigrants in Britain. And my grandparents were absolutely convinced that Churchill had saved their lives. And so we looked up to Britain, America, as the countries that sort of represented, with all their flaws, but represented freedom, openness, internationalism, all those good things. I'm still of the generation that can even shed a tear over a schlock film like The Longest Day, when you see John Wayne and Kenneth More and Robert Mitchum wading through the surf to liberate Europe at Normandy. And in recent years, particularly the last four, and as well as, of course, Brexit, it seems that both countries, Britain and the United States, sort of stand for the opposite of everything that we admired, and stand for the opposite of what Roosevelt and Churchill stood for in 1941 and in subsequent years. And so the book is really a way to explain how this could have happened.
Well, let's start with 1941, which is where you start your book. Pamela, we have a lovely short video of Churchill and Roosevelt's first meeting as leaders of their country. This is in 1941. They'd met before, many years before, but this is their first meeting as rulers.
It's an historic moment as the heads of the two great English-speaking nations meet. A meeting followed by a series of conferences that result in the announcement of joint U.S. and British war aims. An 8-point announcement reminiscent of President Wilson's 14 points, giving hope and encouragement to Nazi-oppressed nations and heralding a final destruction of Nazi tyranny. A forecast of democracy's new order for all the world. While the leaders confer, sailors of the two nations mingle in friendly fraternization, and Sunday finds a notable assemblage on the deck of the British battleship Prince of Wales. Church service attended by the leaders and their conference staffs. Prayers for victory and peace amid the grim setting of British and American naval strength. In an unprecedented meeting, the leaders of democracy plan out the road to world peace.
Well, apologies for the sound quality. The images are beautiful, the sound not so much. Ian, what were we seeing there? What is that the start of?
Well, first of all, what we're seeing is Roosevelt's extraordinary tribute to Churchill by simply standing up, which caused him tremendous pain. I mean, he was normally in a chair and could barely walk. But what we're seeing really is Churchill desperately trying to get the Americans to join Britain and the Allies in the war against Germany. He knew Britain couldn't survive without America. And Roosevelt still was having a very hard time and didn't have the confidence that he could convince enough Americans to yet again join a European war. And so it was a symbolic meeting, really. And the only concrete thing to come out of it was the so-called Atlantic Charter, which was not a treaty, it was just a charter, but it was a kind of blueprint for what both countries thought the world should be like after fascism and Nazism and Japanese imperialism. Well, not yet at that stage, but fascism was defeated. And it was a blueprint again that many of the Brexiteers, certainly the Trumpers, would be vehemently against. It was all about international cooperation, openness, international institutions, et cetera, et cetera.
And so they steer towards this world, which is the post-war world that they both have in mind, is going to have the United Nations, is going to have a kind of economic cooperation in the form of, becomes the IMF, International Monetary Foundation. But they actually also have quite different views of the post-war world, especially because Britain sees itself as continuing to have a large empire, and the Americans are not so on board with that. How do these tensions start to play out even during the World War II itself?
Well, very quickly, and even while they were coming up with the Atlantic Charter, one of the key elements of the Charter was that peoples should have the right to independence. And Roosevelt was very much opposed to the British Empire. He had a certain weakness, apparently, for the Dutch East Indies because of his own background, which is a little odd since the Dutch were probably more brutal colonizers than the British. Nonetheless, Churchill, of course, did not think that the Indians and the Malays and others who were subjects of the British Empire should have independence at all. And so they compromised, and for the sake of really building an alliance. And the compromise was that only the people who were under Nazi occupation should have the right to regain liberty and independence, but not colonial subjects. But this became a sticking point during the war as well, when Roosevelt was convinced by Nehru and other Indian politicians that it was time to grant India independence, and then India could be a loyal ally, but not a colonial possession. Churchill had no desire for this at all. Churchill was convinced that without the empire, Britain would be relegated to a second-rank power. He was right, of course, about that, but that's not an argument, of course, to continue an empire.
Let's pause for a moment on 1945, which is obviously the most glorious moment of this special relationship, if it is a special relationship. And afterwards, forever, Churchill becomes revered more by American politicians than by British ones. But Churchill also comes to symbolize a certain idea of intervention. Churchill and Munich become the exemplar for how American and British leaders should behave for the next 75 years. Could you talk about that?
Yes, I mean, this is all part of the myth that Churchill himself did a lot to create. And Churchill, people forget this, especially in the United States, but for much of his career, Churchill in Britain was considered to be basically a scoundrel and a mountebank and somebody who couldn't be trusted and so on. But in May 1940, he was the right man at the right place at the right time. He had the bloody-minded romanticism to stand up to Hitler when Britain really wasn't in any shape to stand up to in a military confrontation. But he realized that making a deal with Hitler really was not on. Whereas more conventional politicians, and Chamberlain being one, wanted to avoid a war at all costs. And so in 1938, Chamberlain realized that the British weren't ready militarily to fight a war, made a deal with Hitler, hoping that this would lead to peace for all time. Churchill immediately called this a catastrophe.
This is the Munich Agreement.
This is the Munich Agreement. And so ever since, in the history, largely written by Churchill himself to begin with, was always Chamberlain was a coward, Chamberlain did the wrong thing, appeasement became a bad word, and Churchill was the hero, and fighting for liberty and democracy against tyrants was the proper role for Britain and America. Now that went back, that was on an older tradition, which I think has strong roots in a sort of missionary Protestant spirit of the Anglo-Saxon nations being uniquely liberal and free and democratic, and it was the American destiny to spread freedom and democracy all over the world. But that combined to the Churchill myth led to many interventions after World War II, which in retrospect, or even at the time, were foolish and destructive. But I found in researching the book that every time there was a foreign crisis and the question came up whether the United States in particular, and with Britain as its junior partner usually, should intervene, the ghosts of Churchill and Munich and Chamberlain would come up. And so presidents wanted to be like Churchill and not like Chamberlain. 1938 was the great warning against not getting involved, and it led to a great disaster. And so really the main thought in the book is that future disasters can actually already be seeded in the moments of greatest triumph.
And many American presidents for decades have had a bust of Churchill, that bust of Churchill, in their office behind them. So as a kind of spirit of, let's say, foreign intervention. I mean, this is a psychodrama of two nations trying to understand and accept their role in the world. And the British psychodrama before Brexit is Suez, the Suez crisis of 1956 under Anthony Eden. This is a huge moment of change in British history. Can you tell us what Suez means?
Well, that was an example where 1938 and Chamberlain and so on was raised once again. And Anthony Eden, as shown in this photograph, made a radio speech saying that Britain had appeased what he called fascism once, and we all saw what happened, and we have to stand up to dictators in our own time. And the dictator in that case was Nasser, who was an Arab nationalist with ambitions to be the sort of Saladin of the Middle East and liberate the Arabs from Western domination and so on. And
he was the leader of Egypt and therefore controlled the Suez Canal, which was a crucial trade route.
That's right. And well, the Suez Canal was actually controlled by the British and the French.
Yes, sorry. Yes.
But it was in Egypt. And so Nasser decided he was going to nationalize the Suez Canal. And the British and the French were very dismayed by this. And together with the Israelis, but without the Americans, decided to go to war with Nasser and get the canal back. And the Americans then, under President Eisenhower, were completely outraged by this. They saw it as a sort of form of colonialism or neo-colonialism. And in no uncertain terms, told the British that if they didn't withdraw immediately, they would basically crash the pound. And it was the moment that many people in the British elite realized that their country had lost its preeminence in the world. There was still the illusion, because of the victory in World War II, which could never have happened without the United States and the Soviet Union, who did most of the fighting. But that still gave the elite in Britain, and possibly the working man as well, the illusion of Britain. Britain is still the leading power in the world and so on. Suez really shattered it.
And for somebody like Eden, who himself had fought very bravely in World War I, where two of his brothers were killed and one was wounded for life, Eden then is part of, I think, the cabinet in World War II. So this whole long generation of people who'd grown up assuming, of course we rule the world, of course we're a superpower, and then Suez.
Yes, it was a great shock. And Eden is interesting for another reason, which is that one assumes, especially in the last 4 years, that only ignorant and uneducated leaders can cause great trouble. Eden himself was far from being a provincial and bigoted Englishman. He spoke excellent French, had studied, I think, taken a first at Arabic and Persian. He spoke both languages. And so he was an internationalist, and yet he blundered into this, together with the French and the Israelis, it must be said. But in any case, yes, it was a big shock, but the illusion, of course, didn't disappear. And the idea of Britain still being best and still being a great power and so on in our own time is still playing a role in certain kinds of delusional propaganda.
We'll come to that, but okay, so Suez, the special relationship doesn't really work. And then we come to Vietnam, where ditto. This time it's the Americans who are trying to get the British to fight. What happens? Well, why are no British soldiers in Vietnam?
Well, the interesting thing is that it's often assumed that the Americans were A, against British imperialism, and B, that they simply took over the British Empire. Neither of these assumptions are entirely true. The Americans often wanted the British to continue playing a role to help them police the world. And what they took over was not quite an empire. In any case, Lyndon B. Johnson was very keen to fight this war, but he did not want to fight it on his own. He didn't want America to be isolated in this war, and they weren't completely isolated. The Australians fought in it, and the South Koreans did, and so on. But he very much wanted the British, not because he needed the British for any military reasons. I think he said, you know, I don't care if it's a bunch of bagpipers in kilts, as long as the Union Jack is up there with the stars and stripes. And Wilson was in a bind.
Harold Wilson, the British Prime Minister.
Harold Wilson, the Prime Minister, was a Labour Prime Minister, was in a bind because on the one hand, like almost all post-war prime ministers, he wanted to be on the right side of the United States. He wanted to be a partner. He took the special relationship very seriously. This is something that left-wing politicians in Britain often took just as seriously as conservative ones. But he also knew that if he were to send even one soldier to Vietnam, he would lose the left of his own party. He absolutely couldn't do it. And so on the one hand, he supported the Americans. He even tried to defend American bombing of North Vietnam. And so on the other hand, he stood firm and didn't send any troops. And in the end, of course, this meant that he was hated by both sides. He lost the left of the Labour Party, who thought he was sort of a patsy and a poodle to the Americans. And Johnson despised him for being so pusillanimous.
So after Vietnam, America shies away from foreign interventionism for a while. And, you know, in Britain, often the prime minister is Labour, is well to the left of the American president. But then in the 80s, two leaders come together who are very much on the same page. And that is quite, I mean, if you're talking about a special relationship, it would seem to be located in the Reagan Thatcher era, wouldn't it?
Yes, I mean, they were ideological allies. Both of them saw or had a feeling that their countries were slipping. There were serious economic problems. The unions are getting very strong in Britain. The economy was stagnating and so on. And both were also very ideologically committed to the Cold War and fighting the Soviet Union. And the way that they saw this, both of them, was to revive the old World War II myth of the Anglo-Saxon countries standing shoulder to shoulder, opposing tyranny. And Margaret Thatcher was very sympathetic to Ronald Reagan in that sense. They both wanted to revive, in their rhetoric as well as in reality, what they saw as the greatness of their nations, which was in danger of being lost because of weak socialists and leftists and liberals and so on. I'm not sure she respected Reagan particularly for his intellectual faculties. I think she much enjoyed sparring with Gorbachev much more than going on golf carts with Ronald Reagan at a ranch. But they had that in common. They had this notion that they could revive the greatness of their nations by changing the economies, free trade and all that, and opposing the Soviet Union and embarking on various little wars, the Falklands being one of them.
And the Grenada invasion by Reagan, which he didn't bother to ask the British about.
Yes, but these were little wars. And
little wars to restore a bit of... You know.
Yeah, splendid little wars, as somebody once said. And these were largely symbolic. And after the Falklands, a lot of British public opinion, which had not been favorable to Margaret Thatcher because of miners' strikes and that kind of thing, suddenly rallied round her, and not the whole country, but large sections of the country really did believe that she'd restored greatness to Britain.
Well, one part of Thatcher was this pro-American figure, but maybe her greatest animating passion, you could argue, in foreign affairs was fear of Germany. Thatcher genuinely had this insane belief, I would say, that post-war 1980s Germany, as it began to reunify, was going to be the Fourth Reich and was the biggest danger to the world. And so she's in this very strange situation when the Berlin Wall falls, because George H.W. Bush does not believe that at all.
No, she still had very much the view of, well, she was complicated because on the one hand, she was actually a very keen European. And she was the one who created the single market in Europe and so on. I don't, for much of her career, she certainly would not have countenanced the idea of Britain leaving the EU. But on the other hand, she did have that sort of the World War II myth of, and her view of Europe was very much in that shadow. And she thought, you know, the Germans are basically Nazis, the Italians are unreliable, the French are cowards, and she had the Dutch were sort of okay, the gallant Dutch and so on. She got on with the Dutch Prime Minister Lobos because they both distrusted the Germans. But I remember that period very well, and I think it was partly because in the Thatcher era, even the most provincial people in Britain suddenly woke up to the fact that the Germans were not only a more powerful nation, but were also much richer than most people in Britain. It was a much more prosperous society. And the tabloid press whipped up that atmosphere of, this is not fair. We won the war. Why are the Germans suddenly now doing, you know, richer than and more powerful than us? And she partly believed that. And played up to it. And also it wasn't totally insane because it was, of course, becoming painfully apparent that Germany would be the major power in Europe and not Britain. And American presidents more and more would talk to Bonn, the then capital of Germany, really more seriously than they talked to London. I mean, they liked going horse riding with the Queen in Windsor Park and that kind of thing. But the serious power was in Germany.
Yeah, Helmut Schmidt, the 1970s German chancellor, said of the special relationship, it's so special that only one side even knows it exists. The Americans never seemed that interested. One American officer said, we have many special relationships. So yes, it's one-sided.
It was largely true. On the other hand, of course, Germany didn't play any kind of military role, and the British still did, like the French, and that meant that the only times, unfortunately, but that there was some substance to the special relationship, was when both countries went to war.
And they did very successfully in 1991 with the French against Saddam, and they won, and this becomes another of the glorious wars. And then we come to this very fateful moment in 2003, when the neocons within the Bush administration decided it would be a good idea to invade Iraq. And Tony Blair goes along with it. What do you think was going through Blair's mind in making that fateful decision?
Well, Blair has often been called the most American of British prime ministers, partly because, I mean, he got on very well with Clinton because of their belief in the so-called third way. And I think it was a member of his cabinet, Peter Mandelson, who said, we are intensely relaxed about getting filthy rich. This was
people becoming filthy rich, yeah. He wasn't talking about himself, although he also became filthy rich.
I think he also became filthy rich, as did Tony Blair. And the idea was that even as socialists in a meritocracy, it was perfectly okay to make lots and lots of money. And the more money you made, the more virtuous in some ways you might seem. So there was that, but he was also very religious, intensely religious in a way that most British prime ministers are not. And like American politicians, wore his religion on his sleeve. And so he had a kind of messianic view of foreign policy in some ways. And also the great myth of Chamberlain in 1938 and Churchill played a part. In his memoir, he described sitting in the library of Chequers, the prime ministerial country house in Britain, going through Chamberlain's diaries and saying, this is a mistake that I will not make. And so saw himself as a sort of Churchillian figure who had to stand with the Americans against tyranny. And he even made a big historical error, which went down very well in America, when he made a speech in New York, I believe. And he said, in 1940, at our direst moment, the only people who stood with us were the Americans, which was completely wrong. The Americans only joined the war after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Nonetheless, that was very much his sentiment. And so he and and Bush, although politically they didn't really have that much in common, but were both messianic figures and revived this myth of Anglo-America having to go to war to fight for freedom.
And Churchill was very much an animating spirit within the Bush administration. Donald Rumsfeld, at one point when France and Germany opposed the war, Rumsfeld dismissed them as old Europe, which I think, among other things, was an attempt to taint them with their World War II behavior. Could you talk about Churchill's totemic significance for the neocons?
Well, I think that it wasn't so much that Churchill was a symbol of interventionism, although that was partly the result of it. It was more that Churchill played up to a self-image that was particularly strong in America as being the country that had a mission to spread its unique liberal and democratic values across the world. He was the bulldog face of a sort of self-congratulatory, Anglo-Saxon self-image. And that played a big part. I think old Europe, it was more, yes, there was, of course, that idea of the French collaborators and so on. But I think it was more that the new Europe, which was the form of the countries that had been in the periphery of the Soviet Empire, Poland and other countries, had become very pro-American and were pro-interventionist. Even the dissidents in those countries, like Adam Michnik and Václav Havel, were in favor of the Iraq War because they thought America helped us getting rid of the tyranny of the Soviet Union and communist tyranny. We should now help the poor Iraqis and others save themselves from their tyrants. And so they were very pro-American and very anti-communist and anti-tyrants. I mean, that has changed, of course, since then. But I think that's what Rumsfeld was really talking about.
I agree, but I think the old Europe slur was carefully chosen. The Iraq war goes horribly wrong. How does that change these two countries, the UK and US, their relationship to each other and long-term their view of foreign wars?
Well, indirectly or perhaps directly, the disaster of the Iraq war was one of the things that got Donald Trump elected. Because, and the one thing he has promise he has kept to was not getting involved in another war. He revived a different myth, the counter myth to what Roosevelt and Churchill stood for in 1941, namely the America First one, which was the slogan of the right wing in the 1930s, and a right wing that was often, like Charles Lindbergh, more sympathetic to Hitler than they were to Western leaders. So the disaster discredited for a long time, if not forever, this notion of the Anglo-Saxon mission to go and fight wars for freedom and democracy. Now, I'm not a pacifist. I mean, sometimes one has to go to war, but to go to war for ideological reasons, and arguably the war in Iraq was fought at least partly for ideological reasons. I mean, oil had something to do with it and geopolitics and so on. But that particular ideology has really lost credibility. Now we'll see what happens in the next 4 years, because some of the people around Joe Biden are self-described liberal hawks who do still kind of believe in the American mission to use force if necessary to help the cause of democracy in the world.
Now, most American leaders have been able to pay lip service, at least, to the special relationship, not as strongly as the British leaders, and both Macmillan and Churchill actually had American mothers, which helped. But Obama didn't really have much of an interest in Britain either way. And Joe Biden, in fact, comes from a family tradition of Irish republicanism, Irish Catholic republicanism, which is very wary and hostile to Britain. How do you see, I mean, clearly, you know, Biden will be driven by realpolitik, etc. But how do you see Joe Biden's personal upbringing in relation to Britain?
Well, one of the interesting little details I found in researching the Falklands War was that America, of course, the American political establishment was divided on this. Ronald Reagan himself did not quite see the point in the beginning of what he called fighting over a freezing rock. There were those in his administration who didn't want to alienate the military regime in Argentina because they were anti-communist allies and so on. But there were others who saw the point of Britain fighting for the Falklands against an invasion by Argentina, and were rather sympathetic. Some of them were Anglophiles. But one of them was Joe Biden, who was then senator, and said, well, of course, we'll have to stand by Britain because you're British, which was an odd thing to say for somebody with deep Irish roots. But nonetheless, he said it, which I think means, I don't think he's Anglophobic, as some Irish American politicians have been, including JFK's father, Joe Kennedy. But he does probably care about Ireland. And this could be a problem because I think it was clear from the campaign for Brexit that people like Boris Johnson were not necessarily haters of Ireland, but they were completely indifferent to Ireland. They didn't really think about Ireland. It didn't cross their mind that Brexit could actually cause problems. And Joe Biden certainly does care. And so I think anything that would, any move by the British government that would disadvantage Ireland in one way or another, that the Biden administration would be quite unhappy about.
There is talk that his first state visit will be to Ireland, or at least I'm sure one of his early visits will be to Ireland. We won't go into the complexities of Brexit and the Irish border, but Biden will have his eye on that. I want to get to Boris Johnson because I'm also interested in your sort of personal relationship with A. Churchill, who you saw as a child. Maybe you'll tell us that story briefly. And then B. Boris Johnson, for whose magazine you wrote. I mean, I imagine you were a colleague of his at The Spectator. First, let's tell us your Churchill story, because not many of us here today, I think, have actually been in a room with Churchill.
No, well, I was in a very big room with Churchill because I was taken by my grandparents to see Peter Pan when I was 7. And I remember very distinctly, and I can't have really known very much about Winston Churchill at that age, but I remember this sort of plump man with a fur muff coming in and making a V sign. And what is still engraved in my memory was the sight of my grandparents, who were intensely patriotic in the way that only children of immigrants can be, and jumping up and down with enthusiasm. And I was told probably, you know, he's a great man, you have to cheer and so on. And the reason that he was there was that his daughter, Sarah Churchill, played Peter and would often have a little bit too much to drink and was rather unsteady on her feet. But I don't remember anything going wrong in that performance. But I remember the occasion very well. It's one of my most vivid childhood memories. What was the second question?
By the way, people, if you start to put your questions for Ian in on chat, we'll come to them very soon.
Oh, The Spectator.
The second question was Boris Johnson, The Spectator. The Spectator is a small but influential right-wing magazine in Britain. Talk us through that.
Well, right-wing doesn't quite cover it. I mean, it's certainly right-wing now, but when I was there, Boris Johnson was still a correspondent in Brussels, writing complete lies about EU bureaucracy for the Daily Telegraph. And my editor was Charles Moore, now Lord Moore. And I followed as foreign editor Noel Malcolm, now Sir Noel Malcolm. So to be in the right Tory circles in Britain can add things to your name. And it was more a kind of cheeky public school libertarian kind of Tory magazine in those days.
Public school in the British sense, of course, freezing boarding schools, compulsory rugby.
But very pro Margaret Thatcher, making fun of her successor, John Major's slightly sort of South London, lower middle class accent. And so it was in that way actually quite unpleasant. But Boris Johnson was not really on the horizon then. He later became editor and misbehaved and had secretaries on his knee and that kind of thing. But I wasn't there anymore.
What do you make of how Johnson sees Britain's place in the world? And since he's not a man who tells the truth, we have to go behind his public statements. What do you think his genuine worldview is of Britain's place in the world?
Well, first of all, I mean, Johnson was not born into the upper class. His father was a Euro MP, perfectly respectable, but nothing terribly grand. But he had a very grand education. He went to Eton and then Oxford, and was a member of all the sort of smart clubs where they sort of smash restaurants and get drunk on champagne and that kind of thing. And he has a kind of, like a lot of people of his age and class, a kind of fantasy of Churchillian pretensions, Britain being great, being a bit nostalgic for the empire and so on. I don't think this is because they genuinely long to revive the empire, and even if they did, that would be a rather quixotic enterprise. I think it's more that they're aware, painfully aware of the fact that if they'd been of the generation of their great-grandfathers, they could have been running, chunks of India and or been very big shots in the government in London. And now Britain has been reduced to such an extent that they couldn't, any dreams of grandeur are just that, dreams. And I think to them, the EU represents, first of all, really the diminished status of Britain. And I think that their antagonism to the EU and to Europe is rooted in that. Yes, it's dressed up in arguments about sovereignty and the lack of democracy in Europe and so on. But I think the real reason really is that it shows Britain to be nothing more than a major European power, which will never, economically, never be as powerful as Germany.
There's an interesting question from Chris Quigg. I'm wondering about Murdoch in a different context, but Chris Quigg asks, how do you assess Murdoch's influence on the special relationship?
Well, Murdoch is, of course, an Australian who is of the generation of Australians that has a chip on their shoulder, a colonial chip, and an intensely ambitious man who, first of all, came to London to become a big shot in London, and partly out of sort of sheer antagonism to the British elite and establishment. He would show them. And so he's played politics always in such a way that it would encourage it or make him more money. He's first and foremost a businessman, but he's certainly driven by a certain antagonism to the old British upper class elite. And so in that sense, he's more an American than a Brit. And so it's not for nothing that he looked for larger pastures in America. And his support of Trump and Trump's populism is partly opportunistic, just as his support for Tony Blair was before, or Margaret Thatcher. It was good for business. But it's also, I think, partly because it, kicking the shins of what populists call the elites, he's sympathetic to that, because I think he still has that chip on his shoulder.
We've had a couple of questions from Helen Drake and from Bob and Louise Despress about where does the special relationship go now in the era of Brexit? What do Johnson and Biden respectively want to get out of this now?
Well, I don't think it'll go anywhere very much. I mean, I think it's pretty much played out in that it was always the American policy to encourage Britain to play a major role in Europe, inside Europe. So the Americans were never very keen on this notion of the British being outside Europe, clinging to a special relationship with the United States. and being marginalized in Europe. They wanted Britain to be a European power so that it could be a bridge between the European continent and the United States. And as a European power, as Harold Macmillan said at the time, Britain could still play an important role. Outside Europe, it'll be much less important. And if you look at what's in the national interest in America, it's going to be to deal with the EU. The EU is one of the big economic powerhouses in the world. Britain alone is not. And so there may still be some sentimental flim-flam, royal visits and all that sort of stuff. Although even that in America now plays a much lesser role than it once did. The American East Coast elite was once very Anglophile and like tweeds and horses and all that stuff. That's gone as well. So I don't think that there's much left of this relationship, or the specialness of the relationship.
Yeah, that mutual cultural fascination as was, I mean, that is interesting. I mean, it's no longer just America that makes big budget films and TV series, so the Brits have other things to watch. You're saying to me that if I go to the US with a British accent nowadays, it's less bankable than it would have been 20 years ago. Americans don't care about us.
Yeah, I mean, there is still the popularity of the Queen, and not the Queen, what is it called? The television.
The Crown.
The Crown, yeah. No, there is still an audience for that.
Downton Abbey.
Downton Abbey, yeah, all that nonsense. But the American political elite does not mirror itself or mimic English upper class mannerisms in the way they once did. That's totally gone. And so I don't know when the last time was that somebody in New York said to me, "Oh, I love to hear you talk. Please, can you say something?" That's over, and a good thing too.
No, that's very regrettable. Now, large part of the drama has been, and in your book is as well, Britain's decline from superpower to second-rank European power. Is the US going down that same path now?
Well, that's the big question. I mean, yes, inevitably, because every power goes down that path eventually. But and America's power certainly diminished since the mid 20th century or the late 20th century. And China is a formidable power in the way it hasn't been for a long time. So yes, it will be diminished and it will shrink, but it'll take a long time. America is still a very, very large economy. It still has a huge military. Its soft power, I think, is underrated by people who say, "Oh well, nobody cares about America anymore." It's not true. I mean, if you think of the rise of right-wing populism in Europe, in many ways, it was driven by American examples. So it can be, the American soft power can be still powerful in negative as well as positive ways.
Virginia Nelson has an interesting question about, does language play a role? And you could argue that we Brits, thanks to Americans, we still have the global language. And that allows us in part to dominate global opinion making. You know, people hear us just because it's in English.
Well, I think that's true, but I think that's an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage is obvious, that anything that's written in English has more chance of being heard in other countries than something written in Finnish or in Dutch. But the disadvantage is that it's, I think, making both countries increasingly provincial, in that fewer and fewer people speak other languages because they don't feel they need to. They pay less attention, that's certainly true in America, pay less attention to the outside world than they would if they spoke other languages. One of the most shocking statements along these lines that I can remember was made by Larry Summers, who was in the Clinton administration, then became president of Harvard, one of the great universities in the world. And Larry Summers once said, "Why should we still teach foreign languages since everything is now published in English anyway?" Which was asinine, because it assumes that all you really need is information. Well, it's true that information can be perfectly well given in English, but learning a foreign language is also learning a whole different attitude, a culture, a way of thinking, and so on. And I think that's sorely lacking now, especially in the English-speaking world.
Except our viewers here today, our class attendees here today who are Alliance Française US. Last couple of questions. There's one from Milessa. She asked something that I think is on many people's minds in the US when we talk about the UK. She asked, how much influence, power does the Queen really have in all this? Can you kind of place the meaning of the Queen?
Well, actual power she has none, but monarchs can play a powerful role, even constitutional monarchs who do not have political power as such, can play a role in crises. We saw that in some ways last week when the capital was under siege from all these crazy people. I sort of lamented that there wasn't a Spanish king who could sort of restore calm and so on. I mean, because something similar did happen in Spain after Spain became a democracy. And it was the king who then could sort of rally the country and be a voice of reason and so on, pull things together again. That is a role that the Queen can play. But in day-to-day affairs, I don't think she has any real power, and certainly not on the fate of the special relationship.
Lucy asks, in what way is the old Anglo-American vision of world power assisting its self-implosion? I mean, this is something that you've talked about in the past. Why is it that the two countries that won World War II have now succumbed to populist fantasies with Brexit and Trump, the kind of nostalgia greatness? Is there a link between 1945 and 2016?
I do think there is, because I think one of the reasons that Britain never did play the role it needed to in Europe, in shaping Europe. I mean, the Europeans invited the British in the beginning to take a leading role when when the European Economic Community didn't even exist, and the British consistently turned these offers down and turned their backs on them, because they felt they were great and they'd won the war, and sticking with America would allow them to still play that role as the victors of World War II, who were somehow better than in other countries in Europe. And the sentiments that led to the break with the EU were influenced by that attitude. And in the United States, I think too much military intervention, too many foolish wars have made people outside America, but also inside America, increasingly cynical about this notion of the American destiny and its role to uphold freedom and democracy with force if necessary. And so has led to the kind of inward-looking populism that we've seen in the last 4 years.
A big difference between the two populisms. Brexit is very focused on World War II, and they endlessly bang on about it. Trump, though, his nostalgia has nothing to do with the wars. He views America's participation in World War II with contempt. The soldiers who died, he is described as suckers. He has a nostalgia for an America much more of kind of post-war manufacturing and whiteness. World War II is not in his vision. So Trump is a kind of vision of an alternative America that never got involved with the rest of the world. Would you say that?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, it's like fascism in the 30s. I mean, many different countries have variations of populism depending on their histories. And there is something that the two countries, America and Britain, or England, because I think Brexit is very much an expression of English nationalism more than British nationalism, but that the two have in common that, yes, a lot of the Brexit propaganda was obsessed with World War II, but a very specific aspect of it, which was a nostalgia for when we stood alone, which they never did, but that's the myth. We stood alone against the Nazi tyranny. And they want to be alone again without all these foreigners. And that's not everybody in favor of Brexit thought that way, but that was a particular strand. Whereas in America, these kind of things are always related to race. And in many ways, Trump was a reaction to the Obama years. Obama was a symbol not only of a man with an African father, a black man who could rise to the top and become president, but was also very much a figure of the educated elite. And that gave a lot of white people in America the sense that the one privilege they had, namely that they could, at least they may have been poor, they may be uneducated and so on, but at least they were cut above the blacks. And Obama symbolized the fact that that was no longer necessarily true. And so populism becomes, inevitably, takes on a lot of racism.
Ian, thank you very, very much. We've had a lot of comments saying wonderful session, very interesting and informative, etc. So hang on one second, because we are going to thank you in our formal PANU way in a moment, but I will hand over to the president of PANU, Pamela, for a quick final word.
And she'll explain how to buy the book, of course.
Yes, sorry. Everyone must buy this book immediately online through any available vendor. The Churchill Complex, Rise and Fall of the Special Relationship by Ian Buruma. There is much, much more in this book than even in this talk.
In America, by the way, the subtitle is a bit different. In America, the subtitle is The Curse of Being Special, from Winston and FDR to Trump and Brexit.
Well memorized. Pamela, Ian, hang on